four panelists, and we're honored to have from Odessa in Ukraine, Irina Koval. We have Abayomi Azikiwe from Detroit, from the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, and he's also editor of Pan-African News Wire. He's also in Moratorium Now, Movement Against Foreclosures, and is a writer for Workers' World Newspaper. And we have Heather Cotton, a longtime activist since 1959, and a professor at LaGuardia Community College who's written extensively on Yugoslavia. We'll start with Irina, who has a video of her horrible massacre that took place 2 years ago in Odessa, which has been which is basically for which the U.S. government bears responsibility, and which has basically been suppressed. The knowledge of has been suppressed in the U.S. media.
Осенью 2013 года и зимой 2014 в столице Украины, в городе Киеве, происходили массовые протестные движения Майдан.
In the fall of 2013 and the winter of 2014, the mass protest movement called Maidan was taking place in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine.
В этом протесте принимали участие огромное количество людей, которые вышли бороться за светлое будущее.
An enormous amount of people came out to demonstrations to protest for so-called bright future.
Вся страна с напряжением следила за этими событиями.
The entire country was following the events with anxiety.
По своей специальности я являюсь пиар-специалистом и маркетологом, и я часто организовывала массовые мероприятия.
By my profession, I'm a PR specialist, marketer, and I've been organizing events.
На Майдане были мои друзья, которые часто звонили, писали мне и звали: присоединяйся к нам, вставай. Но я никак не могла это сделать, потому что я не понимала, за какие цели они стоят, и что конкретно мне нужно сделать, и за что бороться.
My friends were also at the Maidan Square. They often called me and texted me saying, Ira, come join us, Ira, stand up. But I could not force myself to do that because I did not understand what goals they were pursuing, what exactly I was supposed to stand up for.
Потому что каждый из тех друзей, которые ко мне обращались, они все имели разные мотивы.
Every one of those friends had their own motives.
Я как специалист внимательно изучала общественное мнение разных целевых групп.
And as a specialist, I was analyzing attentively all the sociological studies done with the different groups present at the Maidan.
И я видела, что у каждой конкретной группы свои какие-то узкие мотивы.
And I saw that every particular group has its own narrow agenda.
Это было и вступление в Евросоюз, против Януковича, против коррупции, за свободу Тимошенко, против разгона студентов, и потому что просто там весело.
For example, for the integration to the European Union, against Yanukovych, the current president at the time, against corruption, to free Timoshenko, against crackdown on students, or just because it's fun.
В общем, было только одно. Это все было похоже на массовый психоз. И я как специалист могу утверждать, что этот психоз очень грамотно и профессионально управлялся.
The only common thing was that it looked like a mass psychosis, and as a specialist, I can see that this mass frenzy was a result of the systematic and accurate planning.
Но люди, которые были в это вовлечены, это не понимали. Это можно назвать как управление поведением масс.
But people who were involved in the movement did not realize it, so you can just call it something like mass control.
Мне, как человеку, который организовал в своей жизни многие мероприятия, было видно, что такое большое масштабное мероприятие невозможно организовать, это не спонтанно.
To me, as a person who has organized a lot of events, it was obvious that such a large-scale event, such a large-scale demonstration could not emerge spontaneously. It was organized.
Я понимала, каких огромных денег это стоит. Это и организация сцены, организация оборудования, это палатки, еда, это организация, в конце концов, туалетов.
And I saw how much money would it cost. It involves organization of a podium, equipment, tents, food, installment of toilets.
Самое главное – это направление потоков, куда конкретную точку в конкретный момент идти людям.
And the most importantly, the guidance of a mass of people at any particular moment to a given location.
Я покажу вам короткое видео. Это отрывки из фильма французского режиссера Пола Морейры, который снял фильм о событиях на Майдане и событиях у нас в Одессе.
I will show you excerpts from the movie by Paul Moreira, who made it about the incident that happened in Odessa.
Sans eux, la révolution ukrainienne n'aurait jamais triomphé. Pour les caméras du monde entier, ils étaient des héros. Et une diplomate américaine est même venue leur offrir des petits pains. En février 2014, ces combattants de rue ont fait fuir le président. Et ils ont installé un nouveau gouvernement. Et certains d'entre eux ont pris des armes pour combattre les pro-russes à l'Est. Puis, ils sont devenus un danger, même pour le nouveau gouvernement. Leurs armées parallèles peuvent imposer leur ordre dans la rue. Sur Internet, ils diffusent leurs exploits. Et à Odessa, ils ont commis un massacre.
Результатом противостояния на Майдане стал государственный переворот и свержение существующей власти. Непосредственными исполнителями насилия стали вооруженные группировки, объединенные идеологией насилия и радикального национализма.
The Maidan protests resulted in the coup d'etat and the overthrow of the current government. The violence was carried out indirectly by armed groups who shared ideology of the Ukrainian radical nationalism.
Своими героями они объявили националистических деятелей времен Второй мировой войны – Бандеру, Шухевича, Коновальца и других деятелей, которые дискредитировали себя сотрудничеством с гитлеровским фашизмом.
As their heroes, they declared the leaders from the times of the Second World War, such as Bandera, Shukhevich, Konovalets, who discredited themselves because of their collaboration with the Nazi.
Мысль о том, что этих людей, которые выступали под черно-красными знаменами и не скрывали своих взглядов, фашистских взглядов, не знает цивилизованный Запад. Ведь много лет назад состоялся суд в Нюрнберге, и фашизм был осужден.
A thought that such groups that did not hide their ideological views and would come out under the red and black banners of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that collaborated with the Nazi was just fantastic because, and especially because they received support from the civilized West. And as we all know, fascism was condemned many years ago at the Nuremberg trials.
Профашистские политические деятели не только пришли к власти, но и получили полную безоговорочную поддержку руководства США и Евросоюза.
Pro-fascist political figures and groups did not only come to power, but also received full and unconditioned support from the governments of the United States and European Union.
Все это привело к появлению в Украине противостояния, движения анти-Майдан. Это было протестное движение против радикальных украинских националистов.
This all led to the emergence of the opposition in the country called anti-Maidan, which would oppose the Maidan supporters, radical Ukrainian nationalists.
Таким образом, в стране появились два лагеря. Это Майдан и анти-Майдан. И это особенно ярко проявилось в Одессе.
And thus began the coexistence of two camps, Maidan and anti-Maidan, which was very manifest in Odessa especially.
Одесса – это очень мирный город, и эти два лагеря, они совершенно нормально взаимодействовали. Они делали мирные протесты и мирные марши по городу, выражая свою точку зрения, никогда не пересекая.
Odessa is a peaceful town, and these two camps have been organizing very peacefully, carrying out their marches in the city, but never crossing each other.
Это все происходило до 2 мая 2014 года, когда в Одессе должен был состояться футбольный матч. На этот матч прибыл целый поезд футбольных фанатов, и многотысячная толпа этих радикалов, которые управляли бандеровскими формированиями, устроила провокацию в центре города.
But the peaceful demonstrations only continued till May 2nd, 2014, when a soccer match was planned in the city, and the entire train of fans came to the city for the match, and the crowd. They formed a crowd of several thousands of militants led by the nationalist and pro-fascist leaders from the Maidan.
Они разгромили мирный палаточный городок антимайдана, загнали большое количество людей в дом профсоюзов, который находился на этой площади, и подожгли его.
They destroyed the camp that was tent camp that was set up at the Kulikovo field for anti-Maidan activists, and forced people from the tent camp into the house of the trade unions, and then set it on fire.
Я покажу, что произошло на коротком видео.
I will show what's happened in a short video.
В мае в Одессе началась борьба за правосудие.
Immediately after the May 2nd, in Odessa started the struggle for justice.
Родственники, друзья и просто неравнодушные одесситы требовали справедливого расследования этих событий.
Family of the victims, friends, just people from Odessa who were not indifferent, demanded a just investigation.
Они стали собираться на Куликовом поле и происходит практически каждое воскресенье, и делают мемориалы в память о погибших.
They started gathering at the Kulikova field where the incident took place, and still doing that almost every Sunday, and make memorials for the victims.
Однако на все эти мероприятия приходят радикальные националисты и стараются помешать проведению этих мероприятий.
But to all these events, the radical nationalists come and try to disrupt them.
После 2 мая было арестовано очень много людей, и все они были сторонниками антимайдана.
After the May 2nd, a lot of people were arrested, but all of them were opponents of the Maidan. Those who were among the
Anti-Maidan.
Yeah.
Opponents of Maidan, yes. Каждый раз, когда никто из тех, кто убивал людей, не был ни арестован, ни осужден.
But none of those who actually was killing and was actually guilty in the incident was arrested.
Постоянно, когда происходит суд над сторонниками антимайдана, возле суда собираются радикальные левые.
And every time a trial takes place of those arrested opponents of the Maidan, the crowd of ultra radicals come in.
Вот вы видите на фотографии это здание суда, возле которого собираются такие бандиты военизированные.
Here you can see a building of a courthouse where the hooligans gather before a trial.
Они называют себя патриотами.
They call themselves patriots.
Они избивают журналистов, которые приходят туда что-то снимать.
They beat journalists who come there to video it.
Вот эти фотографии сделаны в здании суда непосредственно во время судебного производства.
These pictures are taken in the courthouse during a trial or investigation.
Они оказывают давление на судей.
They make pressure on judges.
Заставляют их принимать те решения, которые считают нужными.
They force them to take decisions which are favorable to them.
Они называют это патриотизмом и справедливостью.
And this is what they call patriotism and justice.
Вот это они побеждают.
This is their victory.
Именно поэтому мы боремся за то, чтобы справедливость восторжествовала.
And that's why we are fighting for justice.
Мы обращаемся ко всем неравнодушным людям во всем мире с просьбой о поддержке.
And we address all the people around the world who are not indifferent and ask for support.
Capitalist economic crisis and the World War danger is very significant during this time period. And I wanted to talk about some of the history, world history over the last quarter century, and what implications this has on the current situation, principally in Africa, the Middle East, as well as in Europe. Now, developments during the late 1980s, triggering the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, and the Comecon sector in Eastern Europe, are viewed as a turning point in the modern world history. An ideological alternative in regard to the organization of society and its economic and political systems posed a serious challenge to world imperialism that's headed by the United States. Of course, a thorough examination of the dynamics involved in the overthrow of the then existing socialist states in Europe extends beyond the scope of this discussion. For the purpose of our discussion today, we only need to note that what has replaced the public ownership of production and services, along with the anti-imperialist foreign policy of the socialist states in Eastern and Central Europe, which supported the national liberation movements in the oppressed nations and in the industrialized capitalist states as well, is a system now characterized by the restoration of exploitation and accumulation amid a declining capitalist market. Now, there are reasons for the posture of many of the former socialist states in Eastern and Central Europe as it relates to the mass migration that's taking place right now of peoples from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and also as far away as the Asia-Pacific region. Over the last year, the European governments that are least capable of receiving millions of people fleeing from the war and economic disasters are bearing the brunt of this global catastrophe. I'm talking about countries such as Hungary and Greece and Malta and others, where these migrants are flooding into. And consequently, as a result of this crisis, there appears to be a sharp difference of opinion in regard to the handling of the migrant problem between more affluent European Union member states in the north and western regions of Europe and those in the lesser developed areas. Now, we have to deal with the issue of the role of socialism, world socialism, and its relationship to the oppressed nations. Now, those revolutionary Marxists who took control of the Russia and later the USSR, and of course China, Democratic Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba in particular, they felt obligated to assist people still under the yoke of colonial domination. These revolutions had both a national as well as a class character, in that even Russia represented, during World War I, a junior partner in the world imperialist system. We discussed this yesterday in another panel about the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 that divided up the so-called Middle East, which had been dominated by the Ottoman Empire for 4 centuries, and that broke up as a result of World War I. Russia was a party to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but a junior partner, and of course their involvement in that secret negotiation and agreement was exposed by the Bolsheviks when the Russian Revolution took place in 1917. The Korean and Chinese revolutions in 1945 and 1949 respectively illustrated that the socialist transformation would not be limited to the more marginalized European states, such as Russia and Ukraine. Even prior to the Russian Revolution, Lenin and his comrades had broken with other social democratic parties in Europe, who after declaring that they would not support an imperialist war at a conference in Switzerland in 1912, wound up finding ways to rationalize the political and ideological submission to their own governments. In this whole destructive process of the First World War, which resulted in the deaths of millions and the restructuring of the world imperialist system. Now, Lenin noted in his draft thesis at the Second Congress of the Communist International, which took place in 1920, that, quote, in conformity with its fundamental task of combating bourgeois democracy and exposing the falseness and hypocrisy, the Communist Party, as the avowed champion of the proletarian struggle to overthrow the bourgeois yoke, must base its policy in the national question too, not on an abstract and formal principles, but first on a precise appraisal of the specific historical situation, and primarily of economic conditions. Lenin went on to say, secondly, that there's a clear distinction between the interests of the oppressed classes, of working and exploited people, and the general concept of national interests as a whole, which implies the interests of the ruling class. He also said, thirdly, on an equally clear distinction between the oppressed, dependent, and subject nations, and oppressing, exploiting, and sovereign nations, in order to counter the bourgeois democratic lies that play down this colonial and financial enslavement of the vast majority of the world's population by an insignificant minority, meaning those who control the means of production and social relationships in Western Europe and in North America, which are the richest and the advanced capitalist countries, a feature characteristic of the era of finance, capital, and imperialism, unquote. And of course, 100 years ago, Lenin published his seminal work, a very small book entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Now, therefore, the position of the Proletarian Internationalist Party has to be to view the colonial question of oppressed nations within the context of undermining the status of imperialism and its stranglehold over the majority of the peoples of the world. This is a kernel principle of the world socialist movement, at least it should be. The threat of the World War remains nearly a century later, from 1916, World War I to the present, from when Lenin reflected on these fundamental issues within Marxist theory. Oppressed peoples of color from Africa, Asia, and Latin America are not the enemies of the working class within the Western industrialized capitalist states in Europe and North America. Quite to the contrary, they represent the most formidable allies within the worldwide struggle to overthrow economic exploitation. So when you see these right-wing and fascist organizations in Central and Eastern Europe who are saying that the migrants should be sent back to their homes, or they should be deported to Turkey, which was a recent agreement that was made within the EU itself, they clearly don't understand the dynamics of what has brought about this whole global crisis. Now, in relationship to the role of world imperialist war, Lenin also said in the same work that, quote, and we're quoting from the 1920 Second Congress of the Communist International, the imperialist war of 1914 and 1918 has very clearly revealed to all nations and to the oppressed classes of the whole world the falseness of bourgeois democratic phrases by practically demonstrating that the Treaty of Versailles, which was set up in Paris in 1919 to deal with the post-war situation in Europe, of the celebrated Western democracies, and he puts that in quotes, is an even more brutal and foul act of violence against weak nations than was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of the German Junkers and the Kaiser. The League of Nations and the entire post-war policy of the Entente reveal this truth with even greater clarity and distinction. They are everywhere intensifying the revolutionary struggle, both of the proletariat in the advanced countries and the toiling masses in the colonial independent countries. They are hastening the collapse of the petty bourgeois nationalist illusions that nations can live together in peace and equality under capitalism, unquote. And this is what Lenin said as early as 1920 in regard to the role of the oppressed nations in the worldwide struggle for socialism. Therefore, according to the view of Lenin in 1920, in the aftermath of the calamitous World War, and a further redivision of the colonies as well as Europe itself, quote, from these fundamental premises, it follows that the Communist International's entire policy on the national and colonial questions should rest primarily on a closer union of the proletarians and the working masses of all nations and countries for a joint revolutionary struggle to overthrow the landowners and the bourgeoisie. This union alone will guarantee victory over capitalism, without which abolition of national oppression and equality is impossible, unquote. Now, we still contend that there are fundamentally only two economic systems in existence in the world, capitalism and socialism moving towards communism. Despite its limitations and errors, socialist construction between 1917, beginning in Russia and later the Soviet Union, and 1989, when the system literally unraveled in Eastern Europe and later in the Soviet Union in 1991, despite all of this, they made tremendous contributions to the advancement of humanity. In specific reference to the African and Middle Eastern states, in various countries, including Ghana, Egypt under Nasser, Ghana under Nkrumah, Guinea under Secretary Ray, Tanzania under Nyerere, Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda, Mozambique under Frelimo, Angola, Namibia, South Africa. There was an effort to engage in non-capitalist planning as well as socialist orientation. This liberated hundreds of millions of people. It provided a viable alternative to the legacy of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism, which was initiated by the Western European and North American capitalist class. Independent nations such as Egypt in previous years under Nasser, Ghana under Nkrumah, Guinea under Secretary Ray, Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, served as real bases for the occupied and contested zones in Africa during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and even into the 80s and 90s. New chapters were written in the areas of international solidarity and Pan-African unity. The most progressive peoples of African descent viewed the emerging independent states on the continent and the national liberation movements as embodying the national aspirations of the people. From the 1930s and the 1940s through the 1990s, African Americans materially and politically participated in the movement against colonialism and for the building of a new society in Africa and around the world. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah asked in 1968 in a pamphlet that he produced when he was living in Guinea after he was overthrown at the aegis of the CIA in 1966. The pamphlet was entitled "The Specter of Black Power." And he said in this pamphlet that, quote, "What is black power?" He says, "By black power we mean the power of the 4/5 of the world's population, which has been systematically damned into a state of underdevelopment by colonialism and neocolonialism. In other words, black power is the sum total of the economic, cultural, and political power which the black man must have in order to achieve his survival in a highly developed technical society and in a world ravaged by imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, and fascism," unquote. Now, in the last part of this presentation, I just wanted to illustrate the role of Cuba and also recent developments that have been taking place in South America. Many people call it Latin America. Over the last 2 years, one of the most consistent and prolific examples of the role of an international proletarian party and people has been exemplified in the Republic of Cuba in the Caribbean. Cuba, having endured the legacy of slavery and colonialism. In fact, slavery didn't end in Cuba until nearly 25 years after it ended in the United States. It wasn't totally eradicated until the end of the 1880s. For centuries in a racist colonial system dominated by Spain, and later after the so-called Spanish-American War was dominated by the United States. The Cubans fought a bloody war of independence during the late 19th century. They weakened the institution of slavery, which was not, as I mentioned before, fully eradicated until 2 decades after the United States. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 sought to eradicate the racist heritage of the colonial and neocolonial powers, both domestically and internationally. Women, people of African descent, and other oppressed sectors of society were given full rights within the socialist system. On an international level, Cuba participated in many phases of the African Revolution. Many of us know about what happened in Angola during the 1970s and 1980s, but lesser known involvement dealt with Algeria during the early 1960s when there was an invasion from Morocco into Algeria that attempted to overthrow the Algerian Revolution in its early phase. And Cuba actually sent military advisors and pilots and other special forces to assist the Algerians in beating back this attempted invasion. Also, they played a pivotal role in the total liberation of Southern Africa, providing the necessary military and logistical resources in a campaign to defeat the racist South African Defense Forces under apartheid and settler colonialism. In 1975, the South African Defense Forces were several kilometers outside of Luanda, the capital of the Republic of Angola. This was nearly over 40 years ago. And they sent in 55,000 troops. They beat back the South African Defense Forces in conjunction with FAPLA, the Armed Forces of Angola, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, which is the armed wing of SWAPO, Mkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress, and others who participated in this campaign. They stayed in Angola for another 14 years. Altogether, 350,000 Cuban internationalist volunteers participated in the Angola project. This led to the independence of Namibia, the consolidation of the independence of Angola, as well in 1990 to the release of Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners, the beginning of negotiations for the conclusion of the apartheid system, and of course in 1994 the ANC came to power through an electoral victory, the first non-racial elections in the Republic of South Africa. Now today Cuba continues its solidarity with Africa through educational, medical, and technological assistance, and this is readily provided in a myriad of programs. They played a very important role in the Ebola virus disease crisis a year and a half to 2 years ago. Even the United States corporate media had to acknowledge the role that Cuba played in eradicating this Ebola virus disease epidemic that plagued Sierra Leone, Guinea, Liberia, mainly in the West Africa region. The socialist system in Cuba has led by example by constructing a society in contradiction with U.S. imperialism in regard to its values and social practice. This is a problem they have with Cuba. Not that Cuba is militarily a threat to the United States, but it poses an example for people throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America, and indeed oppressed people inside the United States as an alternative to the racist capitalist system under which we live in. Finally, I wanted to talk about what's going on now in South America. It's a very, very dangerous situation. As was carried out in Africa, South America at present is under fierce attack by U.S. imperialism, which has backed counter-revolutionary trends throughout the region. The recent coup in Brazil and the military threats against the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela poses a challenge to the progressive forces throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. Now, although the administration of President Barack Obama has begun a policy of, quote, normalizing, unquote, relations with Cuba, the objective of U.S. imperialism has not been altered. Obama said it himself. You know, we've tried one thing for 50 years, now we have to try something different. This is what he said in December of 2014. Washington, acting on behalf of Wall Street, still seeks to undermine and overthrow the Cuban Revolution. There's no question about it. Evidence of its designs are revealed in Brazil, where the first woman president, Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, was overthrown in a right-wing political coup just a couple of weeks ago. Her crime was, of course, borrowing money from a state bank, which we need here in the United States. It would be great to have a state bank that we could go and get resources from to help rebuild Detroit, the schools, the public services, and so forth. To get money from a state bank and use it for social services amid an economic crisis. That was her crime. The initial moves carried out by the Temer regime, which took over, he was the vice president of Brazil, and Brazil has a very interesting political system because the Workers' Party only constituted about 14% of the parliament, and the rest of the parliament is composed of a myriad of political parties. Some of them are moderate, others are very right-wing and are allied with the United States. The first operation that he carried out was to appoint an all-white male cabinet and to eliminate the ministries concerned with women affairs, African affairs, racial equality. They eliminated the Ministry of Culture, and also other social service affairs. President Rousseff broke no laws and only stands guilty of attempting to service the working class and the poor during an economic crisis. That's what she was guilty of. These emerging economies such as Venezuela, Brazil, China, Russia, South Africa, and others are being systematically targeted for destabilization and regime change. There's been significant social gains made in Venezuela, along with the processes in Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Honduras, and Argentina. Of course, we had the coup in Honduras in 2009. There's another coup in Paraguay in 2012. Argentina now, the government has moved further to the right. The reversal of the imposed isolation of Cuba was carried out due to the left trends in other South American and Caribbean states. Irrespective of social systems, the Caribbean and Latin America is moving towards unity and economic cooperation. This was the trend over the last decade and a half. These developments are a direct threat to U.S. imperialist hegemony, both economically and ideologically. Why should the former colonial and neo-colonial states of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean look to the imperialists for direction rather than their class sisters and brothers in the region and throughout the world? Africans and indigenous people constitute the majority within most South American societies, and consequently they should rule along with the working class and other oppressed sectors of society. It's like what the Black Power movement said 50 years ago, that, you know, if African Americans constitute the majority in a particular county in the South or a particular region, they should run the affairs of those counties, even in the cities, like Detroit, for example, which, you know, now has a corporate-imposed white mayor, the first one in 40 years. Now, inside the United States itself, there are over 45 million Africans who are still subjected to national oppression and class exploitation. They live in the cities, they live in the suburbs, they live in small towns and in rural areas in highly concentrated poverty and under extreme state repression. There's been a recrudescence of urban rebellions and mass demonstrations over the last 3 years, with the killing of Trayvon Martin, the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, of course the killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. This exposes the false notions promoted by the ruling class of a, quote, post-racial society, unquote. The social and political situation in Detroit and other majority African-American cities in Michigan prefigure the plight of the national oppressed and the working class in the United States, with the imposition of emergency management, forced bankruptcy, and the rationalization of large-scale foreclosures on homes, evictions, utility shutoffs, and the denial of bourgeois democratic rights and residential gentrification. The system cannot even afford the existence of bourgeois democracy at this point, for people even to elect their representatives to city councils, to mayors, to school boards. Even if they allow this, they have to put others above them in these state finance review boards and so forth, who are the actual real authority in these municipalities, and they work on behalf of the banks and the transnational corporations. Yet low-wage employment and the privatization of public resources provide no future for the working class and the oppressed in the United States either. In Flint, Michigan, some 70 miles or 110 kilometers from Detroit, where I live, which is the state's largest city, the capital flight of the auto industry has rendered tens of thousands to unemployment and poverty. Through the emergency management system of occupationist rule, decisions were made at the aegis of a multi-millionaire Republican right-wing governor, Rick Snyder, to disconnect the water supply from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, one of the largest water systems in the country, and one of the most advanced systems in the United States, to instead draw water from the Flint River that was polluted by industrial waste, unregulated and unpunished by the state or the federal government. They have indicted 3 people in the poisoning of the water in Flint, but these are lower level officials. The majority of the people in Detroit and other cities want Snyder to resign, and they want him to be prosecuted for the crimes he's committed against the people in the city of Detroit. These examples of international and domestic policies enacted by U.S. imperialism indicate that there is a firm basis for global solidarity and coordinated action. In Detroit, activists from the Moratorium Now Coalition to stop foreclosures, evictions, and utility shutoffs has invited a delegation of trade unionists from Puerto Rico to visit and tour the Motor City. The bankruptcy judge appointed to oversee the expropriation of $7 billion in pension funds and health care obligations for over 30,000 municipal retirees and their families is now, his name is Judge Stephen Rhodes. He's retired from the bench now. Guess they gave him a good retirement bonus. Is now a, quote, consultant, unquote, for Puerto Rico, which is a colony of the United States. It's undergoing similar problems deriving from unbridled financial speculation engineered by the largest banks in the world. In conclusion, I just want to say that we must continue to make these connections and move towards united action. From the neighborhoods and the campuses across the borders within the Western Hemisphere and beyond, we are tasked with building a global movement against capitalism and imperialism. These alliances will serve to isolate the ruling class and create the conditions for complete emancipation and the empowerment of humanity. Thank you so much for listening.
You know, but these are the NATO installations around China and close to Russia, and they are closer now, in fact, because In the last week, there has been an activation of a military base with nuclear capabilities in Romania, and there's one that's about to open up in Poland. This is Poland, but you may not be able to see the words or whatever, but of the countries, but you see that this is, Russia's on its own, Russia's there. It's not got, if it has military bases, it has a right to have military bases. Okay, so the opposition of capital, of imperialism to socialism. That's really what much of this is about, because when we think of the struggles around the world, I think that most of the people here in this room understand that capitalism is a totally destructive force, and it has been since its inception, of human beings and animals and land and whatever it is. It's a tremendously destructive force. But what I'm going to be talking about today has to do with the encirclement of Russia by NATO, and how this is an attempt by the United States to, who's the leader of NATO, has always been the leader of NATO, to dominate what people call the Eastern Hemisphere. Russia has always been a prize, and when the Bolshevik Revolution won that country for its people, for the people of the USSR, the imperial governments after World War I waged an unsuccessful invasion and then a long, long campaign of destabilization and antagonism in an attempt to turn that revolution around. After that failed, the United States waged a long anti-communist but actually anti-Russian campaign. If those of you who go back in years might remember that when they talked about the Soviet Union, they never talked about the word Soviet Union or USSR. They always said Russia, 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 placing in our minds, the people's minds, an antagonism to a country and to the people who are called Russians. That's still around. I want to give the history of that. There's a man by the name of, by the name of John Halford Mackinder, who wrote this in the same year my mother was born, and he was a strategist who wrote something called the Geographical Pivot of History, and we're hearing about pivots all the time now. It's also known as the Heartland Theory, and he said, who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. That means that whole, this is called the world island, Eurasia as Hitler called it. People call it that now too. Hitler wanted Eurasia too. He threw everything Germany had into this pivot towards Eurasia, and it was the downfall of the Third Reich. The Soviets suffered the loss of 27 million people, the majority of whom were civilians, but they fought and they beat the Nazi onslaught. The Heartland Project did not die. Among the imperialist powers, the fact that the USSR survived World War II and rebuilt their economy prompted a new attack on the region and the socialist system, which was advancing after World War II, as Abayomi so beautifully gave the history. The latest cabal of the pivot to Eurasia warlords are the U.S. and its NATO buddies. The grand chessboard author, foreign policy advisor to many Democratic presidents, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote in 1997, ever since the continent started interacting politically some 500 years ago, Eurasia has been the center of world power. It is imperative, he said, that no European challenger emerges capable of dominating Eurasia and thus of also challenging America. He said, how America manages Eurasia is critical, Control over Eurasia would almost automatically entail Africa's subordination, rendering the Western Hemisphere and Oceania geopolitically peripheral to the world's central continent. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. The death of the Soviet Union, which I don't think was an automatic thing, but I can't explain that at great length here, but it wasn't an accident or it didn't implode. The death of the Soviet Union opened the way for the U.S. to begin its final advance. The path was cleared for the capitalist countries, notably the 12 NATO members, to expand NATO. When the USSR broke up, the U.S. promised the Russians we would not expand militarily east. They lied. NATO is a military alliance of the imperialist countries led by the United States. Started in 1949 with 12 members of NATO, it has expanded to 29 countries, the most recent ones, former Eastern European socialist countries, the most recent one this week, Montenegro. NATO is the military wing of imperialism, dedicated to spreading capitalist neoliberal policies, the so-called free market, the privatization of state property, the destruction of social services, and the shift to policies of immiseration for the workers of the world, and war. Beginning with the breakup of Yugoslavia, which commenced in 1991 with the German breaking off of Croatia and Slovenia and bringing them into their sphere, the United States began to move NATO eastward and, in their own words, out of area. It went from so-called defensive organization to one on the offensive. 20 years ago, the political analyst Sean Gervasi, my late husband, in the Prague Declaration, wrote about the meaning of NATO's attack on Yugoslavia. When closely considered, he said, the proposal to extend NATO eastward is not just dangerous, it can lead to a second Cold War between the NATO powers and Russia, and possibly to nuclear war. It must be assumed that no one really wants that. The West is itself locked in crisis. It is a systemic crisis. The market system can no longer produce anything like prosperity. The markets which drove the capitalist economy in the post-war period, automobiles, consumer durables, construction, etc., are all saturated, as sheaves of government statistics, this is 20 years ago, we knew that, in every country demonstrate. The system has not found new markets which could create an equivalent wave of prosperity. Moreover, the acceleration of technical progress in recent years has begun to eliminate jobs everywhere at a staggering rate. There is no possible way of compensating for its effect, for creating new employment in sufficient quantity at high wage levels. Government and industry leaders in the West are fully aware of the situation. They know what the statistics are, they know what the problems are, but they're not able to see that the source of the problem is the fact that, having achieved very high levels of production, income, and wealth, the present capitalist system has nowhere to go. I would add that it would require the ruling classes to see the lives of ordinary people as important and precious, but they do not. And everything we have seen that they have done to innocent people and animals and plants and the earth itself shows that. We're not dealing with human beings. You used the word psychosis before. This is a psychotic state. It is seriously pathological towards human life. Gervasi wrote, the question is whether the world will accept the risk of East-West conflict and nuclear war in order to lock into one region excuse me, economic arrangements which are already collapsing everywhere. He did not live to see what happened to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia's 6 republics were destabilized, balkanized in the Balkans. The war on Yugoslavia enabled the U.S. and the NATO leaders to demonstrate what Andrew Korybko, a U.S. scholar who is studying in Russia, calls hybrid war, a war of destruction of all civil, cultural, and economic structures, which includes military war on people. While most of the left in the United States accepted Bill Clinton's lies about humanitarian intervention, and they did that with other countries as well, including Libya, the fake International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia, which legitimized the dismemberment of a sovereign country and murdered its president, proves that they were culpable. While they were bombing and fighting the NATO wars in Bosnia and then Serbia and Montenegro and in Yugoslavia, the IMF and U.S. diplomats and economic advisors established neoliberal governments in former socialist countries. The U.S. and their Western imperialist marionettes and fellow conspirators absorbed one former socialist country after another: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, and Croatia. Those are just NATO members, but NATO has extended help certainly to arming Ukraine, and many of these countries have actual fascist revanches that, you know, their grandfathers were fascists and Nazis in World War II, and now they're in charge, and, you know, there's a tremendous it's fascism that has risen up in these areas. NATO members, I said, went to 29. Montenegro is its newest member. NATO attacked and destroyed in Yugoslavia civilian targets. That's what they do. 6,000 Serbs were killed. They bombed 25,000 housing units, 14 airports, 20 health centers, 18 kindergartens, 69 schools, 38 bridges. There were 2,300 NATO airstrikes, 420,000 missiles were launched, a third of the power capacity of Yugoslavia was obliterated. They dropped 37,000 cluster bombs, destroyed factories, oil refineries, and NATO used, for the very first time and not the last, graphite bombs to disable Yugoslavia's power system. I mean, they also killed people who were, the Chinese embassy was bombed. They said, oh, we didn't know it was there, and they did. You know, they bombed they bombed a television station, and then they blamed the head of the television station for the bombing because he should have known that they were going to bomb them. And he's in jail now. He's in jail now in Serbia. NATO expansion. In all the new NATO countries, the IMF engineered factory and mine closing, and these advanced nations were reduced to producers of raw materials, the mines and public capital, privatized as part of the IMF NATO program. Then corporations of Germany or France or Britain could expand their markets in the new NATO colonies. My comrade Sarah Flounders wrote a whole thing about, they had a wonderful, that great production of pharmaceuticals, cheap and excellent and safe in Hungary, and the Germans closed it down and didn't open another one, and you had to buy German pharmaceuticals which weren't as safe and were lots more expensive. Okay. The U.S. and German and Italian and other national bourgeois from these countries, the investors created new low-wage factories, and unemployment soared in places like Poland. Bosnia has 46% unemployment. Kosovo, that the United States freed and liberated, has about 48% unemployment, and youth unemployment is, you know, way over 50%, way over. Pensions were cut. Public health care and education were slashed. I just want to say I'm a Facebook junkie. I learn a lot of my history from Facebook. I mean, I'm seriously troubled in this matter. Except I don't really, you know, say what's up and this is the latest thing I cooked or whatever. I'm reading politics from all over the world, so I have friends everywhere. Okay, so that's my excuse. I mean, and I got a lot of the stuff that I learned, you know, from Facebook, because people are brilliant and writing stuff all over the world. So this one woman showed a picture of her mother in 1960 in Lithuania, and she was a beautiful young woman, and she was wearing very lovely clothes, you know, and she was kind of cavorting in the street before this young woman was born. And she said, this is the picture of my poor mother suffering under Lithuanian socialism. And then she said, but she's now happily living on 200 euros a month in the newly freed Lithuania. That's her pension. You know, I mean, that's just one person, but multiply it times millions. You know, when the Soviet Union fell, or was pushed, in the first 5 years, the what's it called? Age of death. What was that word? When people life expectancy went from about 65, which was averaging everything, because in the East the life expectancy was lower than in the Western part. Life expectancy went from about 65 to 57 in 5 years, the first 5 years. So that is just extraordinary about what it does. This is what I know. This is why I cried when the Soviet Union fell, because I knew people were going to die, you know, and they do. Except things are really getting better a little bit, but they're not Soviet Union good. All right. These economic and political developments immiserated the people of Yugoslavia and the rest of Eastern Europe and regions in the former USSR, but they were also part of a military juggernaut that is currently threatening World War III, because NATO is a military alliance. This map of U.S. and NATO military bases show just how they've crept up on the borders of Russia, and they blame the Russians, just as they blame, you know, the United States says that the Russians are in Ukraine. Now, there's 750,000 Russian troops. In addition, they have 2 million in reserve, plus they have everybody who lives there who really does not want to be invaded. So it would be just as difficult for them to invade because the people of Russia, but I mean, they would have stopped the fascist Poroshenko Nazis in 12 seconds if the Russians had gone into there. They lie. They say that the Russians have invaded, they're fighting. If they were fighting, it'd be over. The people of Donetsk and everybody, they'd be liberated now. But, that's the thing. They also make this whole thing about Crimea and that they captured the Crimea. The Crimeans didn't want to be part of a fascist country. That not only that, but the Crimeans were mostly Russians. You find that in the eastern part of Ukraine, is that most of the people have the Russian people background. So they didn't want to be part of these fascists, and the fascists were saying you're not allowed to speak Russian anymore in Ukraine. They're attacking Russians. People are losing jobs if they're Russian speaking. I mean, there was this one thing in the Ukraine where they actually had this leader, and this leader wanted to make a speech, and he couldn't make it in Ukrainian. He didn't know how to do it in Russian. It was translated to Ukrainian. Anyhow, it's no wonder that Putin has asked, against whom is this NATO expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances of our Russian borders? Our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. I would like to quote this speech, this is Putin speaking, of NATO General Secretary Werner in Brussels on the 17th of May in 1990. He said at the time, the fact that we are ready to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee. And Putin asked, where are these guarantees? They, the Western leaders, have lied to us many times, made decisions behind our backs, placed before us an accomplished fact. This happened with NATO's expansion to the east, as well as the deployment of military infrastructure at our borders. Although it has been clear for several years that alliance has no appetite for putting Ukraine on a membership track, Putin went on to express horror at the prospect of NATO forces in Crimea. Russian inaction would have meant that NATO's navy would have been right there in this city of Russia's military glory, Sevastopol, and this would create not an illusory but a perfectly real threat to the whole of southern Russia. Now, the U.S. had promised Gorbachev, whom we could talk a lot about, since he's friends with George Soros. George Soros set him up at the Presidio, which is a place in San Francisco, which used to be an army base, and he had offices right next to George Soros' other friend, the Dalai Lama. So, the fact is that Mr. Gorbachev has just said, oh no, NATO didn't promise that they wouldn't expand. He just did this like within the last year or even this spring. Oh no, it's not really, he said it's not true and there was no promise made. Now, the US and NATO are trying to scare Russia. Their buddy, how do you pronounce it? Erdogan, which I thought was Erdogan, are trying to scare Russia. He just announced that the Turkish military was prepared to attack and overcome Russia with their Turkish military. I mean, he's looking for a revival of the Ottoman Empire with NATO assistance. And there are threats. I mean, and the threats are scary. And I mean, just the other week, I started thinking about this and unfortunately let my whole mind go to how frightening it is to think about the potential of World War III, because the United States is threatening it. I mean, last week, one of a British fellow, one of NATO's most senior retired generals, warned the West of a nuclear war in Russia. He did this because he's publishing a book about that, and he wants it to be sold. It's going to be called, the nuclear war in 2017. So, I mean, he probably said this so he could sell his book, but it was pretty terrifying because he said that Richard Shiref is his name, and he served as the NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander until 2014. And he said the West should act to avert a potential catastrophe should Moscow target, which they're not, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. U.S. surveillance planes, this is just this past week, have approached for the 8th time the Russian border, and this has happened all within the last 2 weeks. And the U.S. blames Russia for all this NATO aggression. In fact, they blame them for everything that's gone wrong. Climate change, whatever, it's all Russia's fault. Russia has not seen such a major military buildup close to its borders since 1941, when the Third Reich sent the Wehrmacht to conquer the Soviet Union. So all over Europe, people are afraid of World War III, and that is something which is making even the NATO countries wary, and the leaderships wary. You know, the United States is very free to have world wars on European soil. No problem, right? You can kill all the people in France or, you know, Lithuania. What does it matter? We're here and everything's fine. They don't bomb a city. They don't destroy your land. Everything's cool. So if the United States planning to do this again is that same American exceptionalism. Yes, you can be in war, except us. We don't do that, but we'll give you the weapons and, you know, help you kill. And we'll even let some of our soldiers die. What do we care? They're only people, and we're not into that. Anyhow, so all over Europe, people are afraid, and the United States just put nuclear weapons in Romania, preparing to do this in Poland. So the people of Europe are aware of this danger. Where are they not aware of this danger? Right here. I mean, I'm a history teacher, as you could tell, because I went all the way back to whatever, but the history that the people in this country know is nil. They do not know that the Russians were the leading force in Europe in World War II. They never heard of it. When I ask my students who are college students, what was the, who were the United States allies in World War II, I got Japan and Germany. I mean, I was a high school teacher too, so I know that my fellow high school teachers were absolutely, I'm sorry, they were terrible. They didn't know history, the vast majority of them. And if they did, and occasionally they did, and then I would see somebody talking about something, and I would say, why are you teaching that? It isn't even true. Well, it's in the textbook. You know.
Football coaches anyway.
No, not in my school. These guys imagine themselves to be, I mean, my first school I taught at, yeah, but I taught at two, you know, decent high schools, one in Illinois and one in Long Island, and they were well-educated people. They were not football coaches. They weren't when I went to school, you know. I mean, the reason why I'm up here is because I had a teacher named Mr. Vigilante who told us in 1959 that if he had a button right here and he could press it and kill everybody in Russia, of course he called that, he would do it. And I was short then, and I would sit in the front, and I looked at him, and I said the only 3 words I ever said in his class, and I said, you want to kill, he said he would kill them. I said, even the babies? And he smacked his hand down. He said, nits make lice. Nits make lice. In other words, the Russian people, the babies, nothing matters. That's when I learned what the nature of the, you know, whatever they call it, exceptionalism now. This is it. So here's the thing that I'm saying, and this is concurring with my comrades here who have done so well, is that it's necessary for people to understand these threats. It's necessary for a mighty anti-imperialist, anti-NATO internationalist movement to emerge. I'm actually going to Serbia this summer and Montenegro this summer to meet with some people. And, you know, I know when you return that you'll know that this needs to come up. I'm guaranteeing you that there are people in Europe, whether it's the people who are out in the streets in Montenegro, and they are, and out in the streets in Serbia, and they are, and out in the streets in France, although some of them have been fooled around with by that color revolution type of folks. But a lot of those people are absolutely sincere. It's not really made in, but they're not clear on how this is all connected. So, as Abayomi said, making all the connections and having tremendous faith in the working class, which also, as Abayomi showed, the people are rising up. They are being led, really. I mean, I believe that the movement that has changed everything is the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the thing, because people were like, well, like the 50s. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember the 50s, but okay. But even then, you know, you're still young, you know, compared. I've known him for 40 years, but he was a kid when I knew him, you know. And I was old. I was a grown-up. Anyhow, so I'm really thinking that we can do that, but we really have to be teachers. We really have to get people in to teach this history, to learn it themselves. I've even written a textbook for my students so they can understand what the hell happened. And everybody should be writing their own textbooks and getting it out, and getting young people together saying, you want to know the truth about this and this and this, and they could learn it. And the young people do not believe this garbage. They don't. They are not with the program. I guarantee you, in the CUNY system here, my experiences, I teach in the system, they're not with the program. They're ready for a struggle. Thank you.
What anniversary took place on March 6th of this year? 70th anniversary. Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, which historians say is when the Cold War began. He said, "An iron curtain has fallen over Europe." He was plagiarizing Heinrich Himmler, but he said, if we lose the war, an iron curtain will fall over Europe. But the Cold War, which began 70 years ago, and it wasn't cold. It wasn't cold in Korea. It wasn't cold in Vietnam. It wasn't cold in Central America or in Southern Africa or in the Middle East. Supposedly ended 25 years ago. It's been 25 years since the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama called it. And when they were ecstatic, this was they called it the longest peace. William Rookheiser in 2000 called it the longest peacetime expansion in U.S. history. But it wasn't a peacetime expansion because, in fact, the impact of the fall of the Soviet Union was like that of a major war. Remember, for World War II, which was the bloodiest war in history, and nowhere more so than in the former Soviet Union, 60 to 80 million people died in that war. Half to a third of them, depending on the figures, were from the Soviet Union. 2 weeks ago, I took part in a march, in the worldwide march of the Immortal Regiment, which was children and grandchildren of mostly Soviet veterans who marched around the world. There were several hundred here in Manhattan, carrying pictures of their parents and grandparents who fought in the war. Maybe 25 million died, soldiers and civilians. And the blood was not dry on the fields of Europe and Asia, North Africa, before Churchill and Truman launched what was called the Cold War. And the Soviet Union wasn't able to rebuild. They were forced to devote. They were able to rebuild. They actually ended rationing before Britain did. But they were forced to devote much of their resources to self-defense, to military parity with the United States, and in the now 70 years after the beginning of the Cold War, 25 years after its end, we see missiles and rockets and missiles raining down again on the cities of eastern Ukraine. The men behind the guns are the direct political descendants of those Ukrainians who fought alongside Adolf Hitler, but this time the United States is on their side. It's arming them. We see proxy war in Syria. We see NATO maneuvers, and folks who have spoken have covered all these things. World War II, it was no tragedy for the U.S. ruling class. 400,000 U.S. soldiers died in that war. My father was in it. He lost some of his best friends, but for the U.S. ruling class, many of whom supported Hitler before the war, it was the best thing that ever happened. It gave birth to the military-industrial complex that still dominates the U.S. economy today more than ever. And but the real gravy was just the destruction, the orgy of destruction that left much of the world in ruins. I mean, the rise of Europe and the United States in the 19th century. The 19th century, the great so-called great powers of West Europe, and then joined by the U.S. and Japan, plundered and colonized and carved up Africa and East Asia, and then they turn on each other with equal vengeance in the 20th century because there were no worlds left to conquer. And these great wars were the product of capitalist crisis. They were the product of this unique crisis that is unique to this system, that where people go homeless because there are too many homes, where people have to walk because there are too many cars, and a crisis that can only be solved by constant destruction. And that's where we stand today. I want to say I dislike the terms regime change, which is so popular now, because it implies that there's something about the countries under attack that caused the U.S. to attack them, that made them the targets, when in fact they got regime change. They got regime change in Russia, they got Yeltsin, they got all kinds of oligarchs all over East Europe, but it wasn't enough. Because the basic problem is that for them they face is, if nothing exposes the bankruptcy of the world capitalist system more than the fact that it has no room for even a capitalist Russia. It has no room for the emerging BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It has no room for the Bolivarian alliance of our people of Latin America. It has no room for the African Union. It has no room for the Shanghai Economic Cooperation Organization. The 20th century was a century of imperialist war, but it was also the century of socialist revolution. And after the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc, it may seem that legacy has been wiped away, but it did leave one huge accomplishment was, as Abayomi spoke about some, was the huge development of productive forces that took place in parts of the world that they had been suppressed and strangled by imperialism. China could not produce aspirin in 1949. Now it's an industrial superpower. And you know, the non-aligned movement came into being in the 1950s. It was only made possible by the existence of the socialist camp, and today the BRICS countries are in a way a descendant of that, because the very existence of their productive resources, the ability of Latin America to be somewhat into greater independence, countries like Iraq, Syria, the independence of Algeria, of South Africa, it was because of the socialist revolutions, and it was made possible by the fact there was an alternative to the United States and West Europe. And in fact, today, the engine of growth in the world economy, and really what makes even the BRICS, the independence of the BRICS countries possible, is the state sector of the People's Republic of China, which is a legacy of the socialist revolution. And so really it's a contradiction. We're dealing with a system, monopoly capitalism. You know, it's not a policy, it's a system. And it requires, monopoly means only one, means monopoly is about restricting supply, restricting growth, restricting production. And it's a system that can only survive that depends upon scarcity. And that, in the end, is the engine for war, and more war. This is greatly oversimplified, but that's, and they have no room for the productive capacity of most of humanity. They have no room for, not only for Africa and Asia and Latin America, they have no room for the oppressed communities in this country. They have no room for Detroit. They have no room for Appalachia. They have no room for Harlem. They have no room for increasing numbers of people in this country, black, Latino, Native, and white. This is a system that has to be overthrown. And the interests of the people in this country are standing with the people who are fighting around the world, be it in Donetsk and Lugansk, be it in Palestine, be it in Syria, where they're just trying to survive, be it in Yemen.